The book of Daniel is one of the most exciting books in the Old Testament. We see that the people of Israel are going to be carried away off to Babylon, and Daniel, right from the beginning, is going to show us how to live for God in an age where nobody likes God. In this particular book, the setting obviously takes us back to the Babylonian captivity, where around 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar makes his final effort to besiege Jerusalem and carry away the captives. As we've discussed so far, there are going to be times in which the people of Israel are going to be carried away to Babylon, 3 efforts, and then in those waves, eventually Ezekiel and Daniel are carried away up to Babylon. Ezekiel is carried away to be amongst the population of the people there, whereas Daniel is taken and put in the palace. And then, of course, the other prophet who's a contemporary is Jeremiah, and he goes south down to Egypt. And so within this particular book of the Bible, you know what? We don't know exactly when this book was written, but sometime around 605 BC when Nebuchadnezzar initially came, all the way to maybe around 535 BC. So you have that time span of about 70 years, give or take, in which God is going to take Daniel, who's likely a young teenager, and he's going to carry him away. And this book is so inspiring. But what's interesting is many years ago, I decided I wanted to kind of walk through and preach through the book of Daniel on a Wednesday evening service. And I got through chapter 1. It's amazing because they're not going to eat the king's food. Chapter 2, you know, it's a little bit of interpretation, but it kind of unpacks itself with the big foreshadowing into the future. And then chapter 3, obviously, it's about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going down into the fiery furnace. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's like, oh, man, look what I built. And God humbles him and sends him out into the field in the wilderness to eat like an animal. Chapter 5, we see the hand writing on the wall. And then chapter 6, we see Daniel is praying as he did aforetime. And so the first 6 chapters of Daniel, man, compared to the second half of Daniel, it's like a walk in the park of understanding it. So I got through chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3 all the way to chapter 6, and I began to prepare for chapter 7. And I thought to myself, man, I don't know if I'm quite ready for this. So the first time I tried preaching through Daniel, I stopped after chapter 6 because I just wasn't ready to get into the heavy details of chapters 7 through 12. Now, with that in mind, we're not going to get into the heavy details. We're going to do a bird's eye view over this, and we'll be done here in a few minutes. But I just want to remind you that Daniel was carried away as an exile in the Babylonian captivity. He's a teenager, and what's interesting is we never read about his wife and his children. And so in all reality, because in chapter 1 talks about how he's serving underneath the prince of the eunuchs, he was most likely made a eunuch. So in other words, to make a long story short, we're not going to go into detail, when nations of the ancient world would come in and take over a city, they would take away the captives, and for the men, they would often castrate them so they could not impregnate their women. But they would take the women and children and raise them and make wives with the women. But now with that in mind, it seems to indicate just the context and the absence of a wife and children for Daniel, that Daniel actually experienced that, and because he's underneath the prince of the eunuch in the early chapters. He lived through the rise and fall of these different kingdoms. He saw Babylon come on the rise. He might have even saw Assyria come on the rise, but you know, we don't know. We don't know exactly how old he was. But what we do know is Babylon comes on the scene, the Persian comes on the scene, and Daniel is going to live through both of those, especially in the first 6 chapters of Daniel. We clearly see that. And it's fascinating to see God at work in the middle of these world superpowers taking over the world. So Daniel is going to see that earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but God remains sovereign, and his kingdom will ultimately triumph. If we could summarize the book of Daniel with a phrase, it would be simply, God is sovereign and his kingdom will come. God is sovereign and his kingdom will come. The big idea is just that. God is sovereign and his kingdom will come. And that brings us to chapter number 1. In chapter number 1, Daniel remains faithful in Babylon. They bring him food. He's in the king's palace, and he's like, I can't eat that. And he says, I'll take the vegetables and the beans and give me 10 days and I'll prove myself. And so in other words, he did. And he was stronger and better than the rest. And God's people will remain faithful even when surrounded by an ungodly culture, especially Daniel. And so we have to keep in mind that God calls us to be faithful in the midst of the culture we're in. In chapter 2, God is going to reveal through a dream that Nebuchadnezzar has the future kingdoms of the world. It's going to be like a near future outline of the kingdoms of the ages. It's a big, great statue that he sees, and Daniel's going to come in and interpret that this part of the statue means this, and this part of the statue means that, and all the way down. And he's essentially saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom, your days of being a king and ruling is numbered. God is the greatest king. In other words, God's kingdom will never end. God's kingdom is going to come no matter what man does. And Daniel's actually promoted through this effort. And human kingdoms are temporary, but God's kingdom is eternal. And we love that. Chapter 3, we read about the golden image that was built, most likely a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And he demands all there, once the music is played, to bow down and worship him. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow down because they were Hebrews and they worshiped the true God of Israel, the God that parts the waters, the God that led their ancestors through the wilderness, and the God that rained down manna from heaven. They were not going to bow down to this statue and worship it because it was made by the hands of humanity. And they were brought before the king and they said, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not bow down. And if we burn, just be aware that our God is able to deliver us even from the furnace of fire. And so, oh man, the Nebuchadnezzar man, he was furious. And he says, let's heat it up even hotter than what it was. And so they take them and they throw them in the fire. And the ones that threw them in were consumed by the fire because it was so hot. And King Neb, as I like to call him, he goes in and he looks down and he says, didn't we send 3 people in there? I see 4, one like unto the Son of Man. And it is very possible, in fact, extremely likely, perhaps even certain, that Jesus Christ was right there in the midst of them, shielding them and protecting them from that fire. And they come out of the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar praises the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Faithfulness to God matters more than personal safety. As we read chapters 4 and 5, God humbles the proud. Nebuchadnezzar goes out and he looks and he says, look at the kingdom I have built with my hands. And God humbles him and sends him out in the wilderness to live like an animal. And then Belshazzar years later, Belshazzar is going to pridefully dishonor God at a feast, and God is going to, with a hand, all you see is a hand writing on the wall, and it's a declaration of judgment. So God raises up kings and God takes kings down, and that's what we see in chapters 4 and 5. In chapter 6, we read about Daniel's faithfulness in the lion's den, where they devise this thing where, hey, you can't pray to anybody that we say you can't pray to. And Daniel, as he did aforetime, went into his room, into his chambers, and he prayed to God. And they saw him and they brought him before the king, and the king reluctantly throws him in the den of lions in hopes that his God will deliver him. And sure enough, God sends an angel, or perhaps multiple angels, to come into that den and to protect Daniel from these lions. Faithfulness means obeying God, even at great consequences. God is a miraculous God, and that is kind of the first major half of the book of Daniel. Now, chapters 7 through 12, let's just pause and say this, that if anybody tries to tell you they understand everything about these chapters, they don't. But Daniel has a vision of 4 kingdoms in chapter 7, the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man. And in this, we see that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of these particulars. In chapter 8, Daniel has visions of coming kingdoms. God knows the future because He rules over history, and He does. And then in chapter 9, we read about Daniel's prayer and the 70 weeks. And Daniel prays for Israel, national prayer. Gabriel reveals the 70 weeks, and God has determined His redemptive purposes and will accomplish them according to His timeline not ours. In chapters 10 through 12, we read about the final vision of Daniel, spiritual conflict in chapter 10, future conflict in chapter 11, and resurrection and final victory in chapter 12. And we praise God for how the Lord was at work in Daniel. And so history is moving towards God's appointed conclusion. God declares the end from the beginning. He is sovereign, and His kingdom will come to pass. And that, my friends, is what the book of Daniel is all about. I'll see you next time. God bless.